Good evening, everyone. We've just started this webinar and are going to take a few minutes to let in all of the attendees. Good evening to everyone who has just joined. We're going to start in just a few minutes, so get comfortable in your chairs. We still have some time to grab a cup of water or coffee if you need the boost this evening, and we'll be starting shortly. Thank you, everyone who is joining us. We're going to wait just one more minute to start. Interpretation has been activated, as you can see in the chat. And we will be sharing some more instructions on language interpretation as soon as we're ready to start and everyone has joined the room. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We are ready to start this webinar for our Community Toolkit for Change. This is Systemic Justice's launch of our resources for leveraging the courts. Thank you to everyone here for joining us on this Tuesday evening. And we have a really exciting conversation ahead of us, but I'm going to first take you through some of the Zoom features of this webinar when it comes to language interpretation and captioning and asking questions. So if we could go to the next slide. Before we begin, I wanted to walk you through the different language functions. We will be having British Sign Language interpretation, French interpretation, and Spanish interpretation. So thank you very much to our wonderful interpreters tonight, Sumaya Sitayev, Deborah Salamax, and Carla Davidson, and Dwayne Parker. To turn on language interpretation, you can click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. If you choose British Sign Language, a pop-up window will appear where you can view the interpretation. And if you choose French or Spanish, you will begin to automatically hear the interpretation in that language. When it comes to captions, we have captions enabled in English, but you can also choose to translate your captions to another language. In order to turn on your captions, you can go to the bottom of the screen and click on the CC captions icon and select the language that you would like to have the captions in. To ask a question, please use the question and answer function on Zoom by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and writing your question in the pop-up window. We will see your question and do our best to answer as many questions as possible. that is all from me at this moment. I'm going to pass on to Nani, our founder, for some opening remarks and some welcoming words for our webinar this evening.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Welcome to this webinar, everyone, which celebrates the launch of our first resources and tools on strategic litigation. I am Nani, I'm the founder of Systemic Justice, and thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening. We are really excited to share with you what we have called our community toolkit for change, which is part of our work to build the power of communities and movements that are fighting for racial, social, and economic justice. And tonight is not just a celebration of what we have done, but also of what is to come, as we have many exciting plans to continue to grow and develop these resources, and to further explore with you how the courts may serve your campaigns for change. And we're very happy to be sharing this moment with you. Before I hand things back over to Miriam, who is our legal projects coordinator, and to Jonathan, our head of legal, I want to take a moment to introduce the work of Systemic Justice for those who might be coming across us for the first time. The idea for our work starts from a very simple premise. Communities should be able to use litigation as a tool for change in their fight for racial, social, and economic justice. And right now, that's not the case, but our work is contributing, we hope, in changing that. Communities that are marginalized by numerous and intersecting systems of oppression are often unable to leverage the full potential of the courts for their causes and campaigns. So our mission at Systemic Justice is to radically transform how the law works for communities that are resisting injustice, and which is also why we do the work in a different way. Our work puts communities in the lead in joint litigation. We are working with a model of community-driven litigation. That means litigation that is led by the communities themselves. This litigation work goes together with advocacy and campaigning to push for change inside and outside the courts. And by partnering with organizations, collectives, and movements that are fighting for racial, social, and economic justice, we work together to tackle the root causes of inequality and oppressive systems through strategic litigation. When we are not co-conspiring with movements and collectives on how to change the system, we are developing resources to support communities in accessing legal knowledge and know-how on their own terms. And this is an integral component of our community-driven approach. We believe that communities should be able to make informed choices about if and how they want to incorporate strategic litigation in their campaigns for change, instead of having lawyers swoop in and tell them what to do. So without further ado, I would like to hand the mic back over to Miriam, who is going to talk us through the resources that we are launching and our plans for the future of this work. And to Jonathan, who will hold a discussion with our wonderful panelists, Aoife and John, on the role that strategic litigation can play in the work of communities and collectives that are resisting oppression and fighting for racial, social, economic, and environmental justice.
Thank you so much, Nani. And I have to echo what you've just said. We're super excited to be sharing these resources with you tonight and to be taking you through them in this webinar. I'm Miriam, Legal Projects Coordinator. And before we start, I do need to make a small confession. I'm not a lawyer myself, so you might be wondering why a non-lawyer is about to present to you our latest edition of resources on strategic litigation. But these resources are not meant for lawyers, and they have not been written for lawyers. They're not filled with legal jargon or academic analysis. They are for movements that are considering whether legal action is for them, and that wish to learn more about strategic litigation on their own terms. As Nani just explained, our work revolves around a central question. How can communities fighting for justice leverage the full power of litigation for their causes and campaigns? And how can they do this while remaining firmly rooted in their power? To further explore this question and get a better sense of what the priorities were for communities fighting for racial, social, economic, and environmental justice across Europe, in 2022, at Systemic Justice, we conducted a Europe-wide community consultation process. During this process, communities shared with us their need to access resources and information on strategic litigation that could go some way to building their understanding of legal know-how. without reinforcing uneven power relations between them and the legal system. We wanted to support communities in meeting this need in our strand of work, which we came to call Building Knowledge and Power. But to avoid reinventing the wheel with the resources and activities we produced, we first initiated a needs assessment on what communities, organizations, and groups needed and would find most useful in order to build their confidence, knowledge, and capacity to leverage strategic litigation in their work. So we conducted this needs assessment over the course of 6 months through the shape of an online survey, drop-in calls, emails, even text messages, and we even received a few voice notes. So from this needs assessment, we received a lot of honest input on the things that we could be doing and producing to support communities access legal knowledge. Respondents pointed to the difficulty of accessing clear information and guidelines on what strategic litigation is, what it can and cannot achieve, and how to identify and build pathways to litigation, how to make use of strategic decision-making, and how to do so in community. Many expressed facing barriers in accessing adequate resources and sharing that they felt that they were unable to productively build their own knowledge, leading them to overly rely on networks of legal service providers, litigating organizations, or legal counsel. Many also reported that existing tools and resources were often not accessible to them and the communities they worked with, or were not adapted to the ways in which they worked. So putting together all this feedback, we developed a plan to produce a toolkit that could start addressing these needs and barriers. And that's how we got to where we are today with our first iteration of our community toolkit for change. The resources contained in this toolkit are strategic litigation, a guide to legal action, words for justice, a glossary of essential legal terms, and how can we use the courts, a conversation starter. Taking you through some of, these 3 resources, a little sneak peek. Strategic litigation, a guide to legal action, will take you through the essential components of strategic litigation, what it is and what it can do, both inside and outside of the courts, using real-world examples, and to illustrate the many ways in which communities can leverage the courts for change. This is because there is no perfect case, but many different legal strategies that can serve justice. The guide is structured around 6 key questions. What is strategic litigation? What can strategic litigation do? How can strategic litigation be used? When should you use strategic litigation? Where can you take it? And who can take strategic litigation? Each section contains general explainers supported by summaries of real cases, both big and small, and each example illustrates the relevant aspects of the litigation project that makes that case strategic for pushing for change. Words for Justice, a glossary of essential terms, does pretty much exactly what it says. It aims to provide common definitions for a shared understanding of legal terminology that can come up when talking about cases. But rather than being a regular A to Z glossary, this resource is divided into 8 different sections, with each section looking at a specific aspect of the litigation process and system, such as the people involved, the types of law, documents that are used, and those phrases that lawyers keep using and nobody understands. How we can use the courts, a conversation starter, is a very straightforward worksheet that will take you through some of the essential questions that come up when deciding if and how litigation can play a role in your campaigns for change, and what the opportunities and risks to consider might be. What's unique about this resource is that instead of starting from the law and what it can do, this tool starts from communities' own dreams and vision for change and how the law might serve it. None of these resources are meant to be a substitute to legal advice, of course, but they are intended to make legal strategies more accessible by providing essential information to activists and movements that are thinking about litigation and whether it is for them. We have designed these strategies with clarity and accessibility at their heart, based on the feedback collected and the many conversations we had throughout this year. And it's really, really nice to see so many of you that had participated in the consultation process and the needs assessments here today. So I take this opportunity to say a big thank you. We hope these resources will become a useful addition to your own toolbox. We like to say that these won't just be another PDF sitting on your desktop, because we do have some really big plans for the resources. We will be translating them first into French and Spanish, and later on into multiple other languages. We will be holding workshops and trainings, producing audio versions, creating explainer videos, and designing accompanying interactive tools to break down the information and knowledge contained even further. Besides building up these resources themselves into different interactive and accessible formats, we also want to keep collecting feedback on how to improve the resources and to develop new ones. At the end of the Guide to Legal Action, you will find an invitation to send us any questions that were left unanswered or that were sparked when using the resources. So do get in touch with us, and we will do our best to see that these questions are answered in future versions of resources that we produce. In the first quarter of 2024, we will also be launching a second needs assessment to revise the current resources and build new ones. We will continue to consult communities working on racial, social, economic, and environmental justice so that we produce resources that respond directly to what you need right now. So yes, this is just the beginning. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it is a very exciting beginning. And I'm very pleased now to hand the mic over to Jonathan for the next part of our launch event, during which we will hear from Ife and John on their perspectives on how communities can leverage the courts for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And thank you all out there in the Zoom room for joining us today for this launch event. I'm very excited because I'm joined by two really amazing speakers this evening, and we're going to explore together the role of the courts in pushing for change from the perspectives of two people who are currently looking at the courts, the law, litigation in their work, and using it as a tool to push for change. But before I get stuck into the conversation with our two speakers, I'm going to take a moment to introduce them to you this evening. So we're very lucky to be joined by Ife Thompson and John Lee. I've tried really hard to break down and reduce their bios into something that's not going to take up the rest of the time that we have together tonight, because they're really very full bios. So you're welcome to check them out online and the work that they're doing. But I'll start with Ife. Ife is a distinguished barrister and lawyer at 1 MCB Chambers, where she works on criminal defense, including actions against police, but she's also working on human rights and civil liberties, housing, and family law matters as well. And as if being a barrister and lawyer in Chambers was not enough, Ife is also a movement lawyer, which we're going to hopefully touch upon a bit later in our conversation today, a UN fellow, a community activist, a curator, a writer, and a Black history expert. She has founded 2 civil society organizations. Again, one's not enough, you need 2 organizations, 2 really amazing organizations. BLAM UK, which is an award-winning non-profit that provides educational, advocacy, and well-being support for Black people living in Britain. And Black Protest Legal Support UK, which is a hub of UK-based lawyers willing to provide pro bono support to BLM activists. And in the courtroom, she's been doing like really amazing, groundbreaking work, particularly around confronting systemic discrimination, anti-Blackness, and racial trauma in the criminal justice system in the UK. Thank you so much for joining us, Aoife. We're also joined by John Lee, who is Advocacy and Communications Director at the European Roma Rights Centre. The European Roma Rights Centre is a Roma-led international public interest law organization that works to combat anti-Romani racism and human rights abuse of Roma. They do this through various means, including strategic litigation, but they're also working on research and policy development, advocacy, and human rights education. John is a Romani activist and writer himself from Wales originally, but is currently based in Brussels, and has quite a varied, I hope it's okay to say, quite a varied background, actually. Has worked, a very academic background, has worked on things such as subjects such as archaeology, forensic science, international relations, and has held down a variety of jobs from the film and media sector to farming, and has worked previously before the European Roma Rights Centre with a Romani and Traveller Liaison Service in England as a human rights, and has worked as a human rights consultant for various international organisations. He joined the European Roma Rights Centre in 2016, and over the last few years has worked with them in documenting and challenging human rights abuses of Romani communities right across Europe. So thank you so much for joining us today, John. So as we've heard from Miriam and Nani, we are very excited today to be launching resources that we hope can demystify and maybe deconstruct how the law and litigation can be used strategically to push for change. And I want to come to you first, Aoife, and ask you as a lawyer, but not just a lawyer, as a community activist, curator, writer, Black history expert, what role do you see the courts playing in pushing for the change we need to see in the world? Can they play a role, and what role do you see them playing?
Yes. So I think it's a mixture of, oh, hi everyone, really excited to be here. Let's just start with that. And just want to say thank you to the team at Systemic Justice for launching this really amazing project. I'm really excited to use it in my practice, and I think it's a very important tool that's going to be used going forward. In terms of where I sit on this, I mean, yes, I'm a movement lawyer and an organizer, and the first point of call that I have with the court system is that it obviously reproduces harm and injustice. So, I mean, the ultimate goal is to have a world where we don't need courts. That's the ultimate goal, because everyone's liberated. We don't need a courtroom to litigate and to control and surveil people and all of the things that court systems do. However, being at the place that we are at now, it will be for us to use the courtroom as a tool to support our liberation struggles. And I always say we can't litigate our way out of oppression, because that's impossible. But we can use the tools the courtroom has in terms of challenging certain policies, bringing attention to certain issues. We can use the courtroom to do that. And those communities have been using it to do that. I think that there is a unique way in which arguments can be run to really support the movement's cause, and also to help others know about the issues that people are facing on the ground and what the law says about these issues, and tying them to human rights struggles, and other civil liberty struggles. I mean, what particularly drew me to the law is when I was in secondary school, I remember learning about the Brown v. Board of Education case, which ruled that segregation was unlawful. And that was one of the ways in which the civil rights movement were able to challenge systemic racism and institutionalized racism that was implemented through laws and policies. So I do think the court has a way of exposing injustice and running certain arguments and points that you may not be able to do if you've exhausted trying, lobbying and all these other means. The courtroom is another way that can be used. We can use as a toolbox, a tool in the toolbox. That was what we movement lawyers say. It's a tool in the toolbox that could be used to support liberation struggles. But I'm also mindful. I'm mindful that majority of judges are white, middle class, privately educated males, and there's only a certain amount of exposure to experiences and worldviews that you have coming from that ilk in society. So I don't think that liberation is going to come from litigation in front of middle class white old men. I don't see that, but it can be a tool that can be used, and sometimes it works. So I think because it works sometimes, it's something we must add to the toolbox, but it's not the only thing that we must rely on.
Thank you. And there's always that tension between courts as systems of oppression and courts as a tool that can be leveraged to push a cause cause further. And I think that's a really a good way of looking at how we can kind of navigate that tension and think about it as a tool in a toolbox, as you said. John, I want to bring you in here. Obviously, you, as I've mentioned, you work at the European Roma Rights Centre, and that's an organization that has had quite a bit of experience using the courts and strategic litigation, as Aoife says, as a tool in the toolbox. Can you talk us through why you use this tool as an organization, and why you engage with the courts in your work, and what kind of role you've seen them playing in pushing your work forward?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. I should start by saying I am not a lawyer. Maria mentioned at the beginning that she was not a lawyer, so I feel like I should preface everything with the fact that I work with a legal organization. I know lots of lawyers, but myself, I talk for a living. This is my job. And we do use strategic litigation at the ERSC because I think short of, I don't know, popular uprising or direct action, we think it is the most effective way of challenging injustices within a functioning democracy. I say within a functioning democracy because there are some countries where this is not possible. We no longer work in Russia, for example, because the rule of law has been weakened so much there that we can't effectively use legal action as a tool of activism. I've also been very ill recently, which is why my voice will slowly sort of fade into nothing as I talk every now and again. But strategic litigation for us is really a tool of activism, similar to what Aoife was saying, I think. We don't have the kind of lawyers at the ERC that have this reverence kind of for the law as being noble and just, or even always fair. For us, it really is a vehicle that we can use to bring about change for Romani people. And it's what drew me to the ERC, actually. It's a very practical tool of activism. So, we're not talking about capacity buildings or trainings or conferences, or my least favorite phrase, best practices here. At the ERC, we're using litigation to keep roofs over Romani families' heads when the municipality want to evict them. We use it to keep the lights on when power companies use illegal collective meters to bill whole communities for electricity. We sue water companies when they refuse to connect Romani neighborhoods. And most often we take governments to international courts when their police officers brutalize, torture, and kill Roma in the streets. Now, I don't think, similar to Aoife, that litigation is the only tool. We still need political advocacy. We still need campaigning, community activism, social journalism, things like that. But litigation for me does something that others can't quite, and that's quite important for us within the Roma rights movement, which is that it creates like sort of a factual record of human rights abuses. So it's much more difficult to argue away structural racism against Romani communities when a court issues a judgment. It changes from being a matter of opinion to a matter of fact or historical record. And for us as Romani people who are constantly accused of lying about things like this written judgment can actually be really powerful for us. Even if it doesn't always change the situation, sometimes this undeniable truth sort of a matter that a court judgment can provide. It's important to us in a way that I think we don't really get from political activism, where truth is maybe a bit more malleable and subjective. I'm aware I'm talking myself out of a job here because we do other things other than strategic litigation. We do have also political advocacy, rights-based research, many of the things that Jonathan mentioned. But it's this litigation work and the relationship and trust it builds with individuals and communities. That's what gives us the legitimacy in all the other activities that we do.
Thank you. And I think I'm also hearing from both of you this idea that because it's a tool in the toolbox, it can never be something just by itself or something that can act alone in pushing for change, and it's always sitting in a context where it's leveraged in some way, or it can push push for change to a certain extent, and maybe not all the way. I'm also conscious that we're talking about legal processes as a tool, and there might be a lot of people out there who are like, this is great, this is just what we need. But the reality is that litigation is actually something that can feel quite remote and inaccessible to many people, particularly those communities that are already like resisting systemic injustice on a day-to-day. And you've shared some of the dynamics and barriers that can come up, you know, in the legal profession, the white steel male judiciary, the legal system itself, that can really make it so much harder for this tool to actually be used in practice. So I'm curious to hear some of your reflections about lawyering practices, actually, and the role of lawyers and communities working together to use the courts for change. So if I could just call on you now. I mentioned at the outset that you're a movement lawyer. You write extensively about it. You deliver trainings on it, but you're a movement lawyer in practice as well. It comes through in your practice. Some people out there might be hearing this term for the first time, movement lawyering or being a movement lawyer. Could you tell us a bit about what that means to be a movement lawyer, and why you see it as being so necessary in the fight for racial, social, and economic justice?
Yes, so movement lawyering as a term, I would say originated in America. A lot of scholarship comes from there, a lot of reading, a lot of writers on this subject are based in America, so that's definitely your first entry point. And for me, my understanding of movement lawyering and how I practice is that it's a way of lawyering to support the liberation of communities. And for me, I always tell everyone how my activist was before I became a lawyer. And I think that's a very important thing to disclose, because as someone who's an activist, I was always in movements. I was always around movements. So it became almost second nature for me to incorporate the goals and the beliefs of the movement into my practice, and finding ways that I could use the law creatively. Because the law is very rigid. When you go to law school, you're taught a very one-dimensional status quo way of lawyering that is ineffective if you want to challenge systemic racism. It's ineffective if you want to bring community-based issues into the courtroom. It doesn't work. So it's having to think creatively and think about what are the goals for liberation for your movement, and bringing that into the courtroom. So for me, in terms of how I have done things, I say it's twofold. I say one way, it's how you deal with cases individually. So I know for like me, even though I'm not doing a massive strategic litigation case, the case that I did with a young person that was stopped and searched, who ran away from the officers because they were in plain clothes, but also when he heard that they were officers, he felt really, really unsafe. And he said that because the police often disproportionately kill black and brown communities and use a disproportionate level of force, he didn't feel safe being around the police. So it became clear to me when reading his case and thinking about how to run the case, that we would need a racial trauma expert to speak to these issues, to expose to the courtroom how the violence of racist policing affects people's day-to-day actions, and also how they operate or how they are when they are around the police. And that is an important context that needs to be brought into the courtroom space. But for me, if not for my work as a movement organizer, I wouldn't even know about the concept of racial trauma. It was through my work with my not-for-profit Blam UK where I became very familiar with things that affect the racial esteem and racial well-being of black communities. And in particular, I learned about racial trauma, the effects of racism on your well-being, and how it can cause race-based anxiety and stress. And Blam, 3 years ago, we launched a free online workshop-based therapy with black therapists, and it's free for anybody that's black in the UK in the community to join. And we looked at what racial trauma is and actually ways that you become racially well. So because of my extensive work in the community, I when my client told me how he was feeling when the police stopped and searched him and how he felt that day, it was second nature for me to be like, this sounds like racial trauma. we need to get a racial trauma expert, and we need to put on the court's agenda, on the Crown's agenda, that the reason our client acted this way is because of racial trauma. And had you considered that when you brought this case to court? And now that you know about this, are you going to continue the prosecution? And in my case, after I'd written my reps to the CPS, and I named many research reports and general government reports that highlighted the issue of systemic racism, racism in the criminal justice system, racism in policing, institutionalized racism. I put that all in my reps to the CPS, and they had read, and after they had read it, they then ended up offering no evidence. So that's why I say that movement lawyering is twofold. It's not just the big legal challenge that you do against systemic racism in the police service by like stop and search racial profiling. It's also how in your day-to-day cases with your one client who doesn't represent the whole movement but is somebody who's affected by racial injustice, how even within your lawyering for your individual client you bring the concepts that are rooted in liberation struggles into the courtroom. And then I say secondly, again, as a wider point of view, it's seeing how you can leverage the courts to support and to call out racial injustice and to hold the state to account. So I think it's twofold, but I think one thing is that it's always done with community and in community. What you often find is a lot of lawyers, they see an issue because they're passionate, or they can see that, oh, there's a problem with the police service and how they are targeting certain communities, and they want to use a legal challenge to call out this issue. But because they are detached from movements, they look for a claimant that matches the claim. They find somebody, do the challenge, a strategic challenge, and maybe the challenge might fail. But one of the key issues that organizers have reported back is that lawyers are not comfortable to run the radical arguments because they're scared they might lose the argument. But it's not always about winning. Sometimes it's about, even if you do lose, you need to be able to show that the system is also unfair. The state is also unfair. I mean, the state's avenues of redress, which is a courtroom, is also unfair. So it's not always about winning, but with lawyers, we're trained to just want to win a case, and if we don't win, if the case is unwinnable, we won't take it on. And often what is a problem with this type of lawyering that isn't focused on supporting movements is that even if the case is lost, because this case wasn't something that came about by the community requesting support from the lawyer, it was a lawyer down approach. When the case doesn't go well, or when you do lose in court, there's no follow-up, there's no action plan, because the lawyer isn't thinking about, oh, well, if we lose the case, I'm gonna support on another challenge, I'm gonna support on on the ground campaign, because they're not part of the movement. If you're not part of something, you can't think further, because you wasn't even there in the planning stages. And also you neglect the other ways in which the community have been organizing and doing things to challenge this unlawful bill or an unlawful statute or whatever. And I think it's particularly important because communities have been on the ground doing this work. They've been doing petitions, they've been doing reports, they've been doing sit-ins, whatever they've been doing to mobilize. And when you come in as a lawyer removed from the movement, you missed out on all the richness of that history. But also what you missed out on is seeing whether at this particular time, is it best to raise a legal challenge? Should we wait a year's time? Like what makes this particular moment the best time to do a legal challenge? And movement lawyering enables you to work with movements because you're part of them, and actually say, you know what, maybe this particular time it might not be best to do a legal challenge, but it would be really, really good to do a petition. Or it'd be really good for us to do a massive campaign on social media. It might be really good to write an article about this. Or it might be really good to do a legal challenge just to get some disclosure from the state that they refuse to give via your normal request. So it's planning and plotting what is the best way forward for a particular issue and how we can advance the cause further. And I'll give one more example before I round off. There is a group, they just started a project called the Erase Database, but before that it was Forefront, it was Unjust, and it was Tottenham Rights, and they've been working particularly on the Gangs Matrix, which is a racist database that was set up in 2011 after the 2011 uprisings, and majority of people that were placed on this Gangs Matrix were young black men. Many had committed no crimes on there. Some of them may be victims of crimes, and it was a way for the state to over police you, share data with other state bodies like your schools, job centres, housing associations, you name it, local authorities, and a way to make your life just a living misery, because you find that you're getting excluded from school because you're known as a gangster, even though you're not a gangster, but the police have labeled you as one. You don't know you're on this database, you can't challenge it. So there was a number of human rights abuse that was going on with this database, and it was actually community groups that exposed the database and they found out about it because they were on it, and they found out about it. They raised the alarm bell, and through their mobilizing through reports, they did a report to Amnesty International. They complained to the Information Commissioner about the unlawful data sharing and things like that. It moved the Mayor of London to remove, I think it was up to 1,000 Black people that were on that database. I think there was 2,000 people on that database. They moved like 1,000. That was just through community organizing efforts. So I say that because sometimes we rely on courts to be the be all and end all, but actually communities have been organising beforehand and have been ensuring that they can raise these issues and call them out. So I think it's particularly important as a movement lawyer to be in community, see what is going on the ground, and seeing how you can build up the movement and not take over. I think lawyers come in, they're used to being the beacons of knowledge, the people that are always correct, right? And people trust them. I think when you walk into a room and say you're a lawyer, everyone trusts you because, oh, you must be, really well educated, really well studied. And it's a detriment of the movement because you become the focus as opposed to the movement. So movement lawyering is actually taking away from the fact that you're a lawyer. It could even be that you're in the space just helping peck away the chairs. You're not there because you're a lawyer, you're there because you support the movement. And if your skills can be used to support the movement, whether it's through drafting certain documents for the movement, whether it's legal challenges, whether it's helping write a report, then you use your skills to support the movement, but you don't take over and you don't center legal challenges as the only way to support the movement.
Thank you, Aoife. And from what you're saying there, deference has already come up as a word, but I think there's this idea of shifting from deference to the law, or like you said, to the win. These things that lawyers can sometimes be fixated on, and actually deferring and working more closely with like the reality that communities are working in, or the movement is experiencing, and actually using that, deferring to that, and not the law and the rigidity of the law and everything that goes with that. I'm going to come to you, John, but I just want to say to everybody who's joining us, there you can ask questions live using the Q&A function on Zoom, and hopefully we will have some time to pick up some of those questions. So do feel free to write any questions that you have, and we'll try to get to them at the end. But just coming to you, John, so you're an organization that works with Roma communities across many jurisdictions across Europe. Can you tell us how you work with communities and how you as an organization have sought to be Roma-led and community-driven in your approach?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I agree with everything basically that Aoife just said. I think the more that different racialized communities, or even just minority communities within Europe, kind of communicate about things like this, because in 2013, it came out that the Swedish police had a list of every single Romani person in the country. There are over, well, every single one they could find, including 1,000 children, entire genealogies of families, for no other reason, just to keep an eye on them based on their ethnicity. And the challenges to things like that, I think there's lots of like overlaps that, we could be kind of working, not necessarily you and me, but communities could be working together on this, not operating in silos as much. So yeah, I can explain so quickly how the ERRC works. So we're principally a international legal center, as you said at the beginning, Jonathan, which means we work here in Brussels, where I've got access to EU institutions. But most of our cases then take place at the European Court of Human Rights or other international committees and tribunals. But that's only really, in terms of like the actual activities we're doing, that's about a third, like the final third of our work. The majority of the activity that we do is done at a national or actually a very local level with specific communities or even individuals. We work across 16 countries in Europe, mostly Central and Eastern Europe, but some Western countries too. And normally in every country that we work, we have human rights monitors, lawyers, local activists, and then in a few countries we've got local volunteer groups as well. And so this like human rights monitoring is really sort of the basis for lots of the work we do. These are the people who are working and often living within Romani communities who face human rights violations. They're the ones who tell us what's going on in the country. They keep us informed on sort of structural inequalities, abuses by state authorities, as well as any kind of like emergency human rights abuses which he could respond to. So a forced eviction or a pogrom, for example. On top of that, we have a lot of partner organizations. So they're normally local or community organizations which help us or jointly bring cases in the interests of Romani communities. And this could be all sorts of things. It could be to help challenge ethnically targeted police raids in Slovakia, cases we've had. Could be to litigate for access to water for like Roma majority segregated villages across much of the Western Balkans. Recently, so in the last like 2 years, we've also been experimenting with what we call mass legal complaints in a few countries, mostly in the Balkans. And the idea here is really to kind of challenge a little what our conception of what strategic litigation means. Because traditionally, similar to what you mentioned before, that strategic litigation has always been about crafting, say, a perfect case, which perfectly represents a structural issue, finding a litigant to represent, and then crucially winning that case in order to theoretically bring about a domino effect for people in a situation that's similar everywhere. And sometimes that certainly works in the past. But we've also had lots of cases where we think we've brought perfect cases and they either don't have the effect that we thought, or it's just not at all what the community we're representing necessarily sees their priority. And this goes back to what Aoife was saying about lawyers swooping in and bringing cases that we think they think represent the community. So this idea of mass legal complaints is to bring cases or legal complaints to either a court or legal body on behalf of hundreds or even thousands of Romani people, rather than trying to prove structural racism through a single case. We bring dozens of them to the same court. And we figured that if you're a judge, it is much more difficult to say this is a one-off case of discrimination when your court schedule is full of Romani people telling you exactly the same thing is happening to them. Usually these sort of cases, they're not actually the kind that a lawyer would necessarily dream up when they think of strategic litigation. It's often things like demanding that the municipality provide streetlights to Roma neighborhoods so children can play safely. It's things like regular rubbish collection to segregated areas, paved roads, access to public transport, basic things that communities need that affect huge swathes of population in a given country. And yeah, just to finish up, I think these kinds of things probably would not have been done if the ERC had not become a Roma-led organization. Our board is majority Romani now. Our entire management structure and more than half of the people working for us are Roma. We are very lucky to have strong non-Roma allies active and working at the ERC, without whom we couldn't do what we do. But for us, having Roma in positions to leverage change means, similar to what Aoife said, different perspectives on rights abuses. It means different kinds of cases are brought even. And we're also much, much more willing to take cases which we may lose to try and sort of push the bounds of how the law can be used as a tool of activism. And as you said, lawyers really hate to lose. So this is something that really comes more with being an activist organization first and a legal organization second, I think.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a good place to move on to my final two questions for you both. I want to end on something that's kind of forward-looking and hopeful. Obviously today we're excited and we're celebrating the launching of these tools and resources that we hope can give individuals and communities a foundation to explore how they can use litigation on their own terms to push for the change they want to see, as you just said, John. Aoife, What excites you most about the prospect of communities and movements rather than lawyers, as we've talked about today, being the strategists behind leveraging the courts for change? What do you see most exciting about that as a future prospect?
I think what is most exciting is that, as John has been saying, like so well, like those closest to oppression, they know best what freedom looks like. They know, because they're experiencing oppression, what freedom looks like for them. And I think because of that, there's a much more deeper need to dream imaginatively and to think vastly. And I think, you know, I'll give one example. So with this case of the Manchester 10 case, which is a really awful case of, you know, systemic racism, you have 10 black boys that have been jailed under they've been found guilty under conspiracy theory. Some of them conspiracy to commit GBH. And what you have is some people have only just been in the group chat and said literally nothing, and they've gotten 8 years in prison because they were all black men. The prosecution run it as that they were gang members, and we know what happens when you run certain narratives because of anti-blackness in society. So effectively, with that case at the sentencing hearing, an amazing group called Kids of Colour, they run a community call out asking for anybody in the community to say what kind of support will they give these young people if they are giving a sentence in the community, if they are spared custody, what support would they give? I think over 400 people and groups wrote in saying what support they would give these young people. And Kids of Colour prepared a amazing document, a report to the court saying to the court, you do not need to send these people to prison if they allow this report to be used and allow the people that are on that have volunteered to give their time to support these young people, they can be supported in the community. And you know, your average lawyer isn't going to be able to do that. They don't even probably even know 400 community groups and community members to write to the court. And for me, that idea of seeking support outside the state mandated systems for support like probation and drawing on our community to give a labor of love is just something way more expensive than the system can currently give us, right? And it's all this idea of like healing harms and supporting communities that have been let down by the state. And I think when you work directly with communities, there's so much room for dreaming differently, thinking differently, and expanding your worldview, because I feel like lawyers are in silos, they're in courtrooms, they're just doing the same thing day in, day out. And it's a very rigid, repetitive profession. You don't have time to dream, but when you're in movements, it's all about, you know, thinking about a different world. I mean, even the concept of abolition, it's really rooted in the idea of dreaming about what a world without prison can look like, but also what do we need in place to ensure that our communities are safe so we don't need prisons. What can we put in place now? What steps can we take now to support our communities? And I think with these systems, you have to sit down and really think, what does freedom look like? And I think with movement lawyering and with working with communities, there's space for that, but there's also a specific time for that, because you're in groups, you're meeting with each other, you're talking about issues, and you're thinking about solutions. Whereas as a lawyer, everything is just within, how can I run this legal point and how is it going to win, as opposed to like, what are the aims of the movement and how can we creatively use the law to support that particular endeavor? And if the law doesn't work, what other route can we take? So I think for me, it's really exciting because it thinks about ways that change can be made. And I think any space that you have to do that is always exciting, because we can't go on like this. You know, it cannot be that this is the norm and we accept it. We have to be able to keep dreaming that another world is possible. And I think movement lawyering gives us that hope that we need. Miriam Kaba, one of my favorite thinkers, she said that hope is a discipline that we must practice every single day. So if we are constantly practicing hope, that means we are finding different ways to ensure that this will have to be the reality that we live in. And I think that's always exciting. So I think with this toolkit and with movement lawyers on the ground, we can be making a further strides towards liberation, which is what I'm excited about.
Yes, and thank you, Eva. And John, coming to you, looking ahead to your work, both as an organization, as European Roma Rights Centre, but also as someone who, is an advocacy and communications expert. What are you most excited about and hopeful for in the future of strategic litigation and the work you're doing?
I don't know if I'm an advocacy expert. I talk a lot. Excited. I'm not sure excited is the word I'd use, but maybe I am optimistic or confident that a focus on human rights-centered approach to anti-racism seems to be returning in Europe, particularly one which places strategic litigation front and center as a response to institutional racism. So organizations such as yourself coming around. In the UK, I see more human rights focused barristers and would-be barristers coming through, which is great. And I really do believe a rights-centered approach is the way to dismantle systemic racism. I say I'm cautiously optimistic rather than excited because I'm aware of the size of the task in front of us, I think. Roma are the largest ethnic minority group in Europe, and while many of the human rights abuses that our communities face are somewhat unique, we do not exist in a bubble, and Europe is in a very troubling place at the moment right now as the far right becomes not so much a fringe movement anymore, but more frequently a party of government in many countries. I think a lot of people are in kind of denial about how bad things have got and could still get if we keep allowing fascist politics away in, basically. I think at the moment, sort of the Holocaust is no longer considered an original sin of the continent like it used to be. Old sort of taboos have resurfaced if they ever went away. And you've got hate speech now coming, I'm sure not just directed against Roma, but from the very highest level of government throughout Europe. And it's not just the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban describes Roma as his country's historic burden, but we had Matteo Salvini in Italy in recent years promising a cleansing of Roma street by street. In Bulgaria, the deputy prime minister has called for patriotic formations against creeping gypsyization of society. The same guy who called for a final solution in 2019. So this is the kind of the daily reality, I guess, that the ERC is confronted with in our daily work. But I know that sort of desperate times produce good activists, so I'm confident. I'm sounding less confident that Europe has the activist lawyers necessary to do their part in defending against this. And yeah, just to go back to what I mentioned earlier, I'm optimistic that the more we cooperate, the more we act in solidarity with other groups who are also targets of this kind of hatred, the better prepared we will be to defend the rights of our communities and I guess everyone who stands to lose from the normalization of this sort of politics. Thanks.
Thank you, John. And thank you both. I'm very conscious of the time. I guess everybody can tell we could be talking about this for much longer. I know there have been some questions in the chat, and some of them have been responded to in writing, I believe. Aoife, there are a couple that you want to respond to. If you can do it very quickly here, so we can still keep time.
So the question from someone called Kevin, and I really agree with you in terms of you're saying the discussion involves is revolving around the ways in which lawyers need to change, and there's a pressure need to change. But I also think movements can do more to hold lawyers to account. There's some movement groups that have said to lawyers, unless you serve in our community for at least 3 months, you can't take on a strategic litigation case for us. You can't work with our community unless you're part of it. So I think we can demand more. We can say, we want you to be involved and invested in our communities and understand us to the T. And I think that movement should make such demands. So I've heard of some movements saying that unless the lawyer's been to about 3 or 4 protests with them and helped organise it, they can't represent the community. So I think being upfront with our demands is really important. And I'll give an example because there was a challenge to the gang matrix database by a human rights group, and one of the complaints from the community organization that was represented by that human rights group was that essentially when it came to settlement, some of these settlement agreement that was initially laid down was saying things like, we think the gangs matrix is a helpful tool for policing, and that community organizers like, we would never say it's a helpful tool. It's always been a racist and problematic tool. But because that lawyer wasn't embedded in that community group and understood the community group's aims and visions for liberation, they were putting forward points that were just removed from the communities in its entirety, and that particularly that community's group. So I think, yeah, I think movements can demand more from lawyers, and I think we should. I think, if they're going to be coming to communities and helping to support change, they need to be embedded in communities. And I think as movements, we can demand more for lawyers. And also, I guess one beautiful thing about movements as well is the idea of being committed to learning and supporting people in wanting to learn and to be better. I mean, that's why we have some things like reading groups together and things that we do to strengthen our knowledge about liberation struggles. So it could even be some of the points raised today, some of the articles raised today. You could demand that the lawyer needs to read that before they can even take part in supporting the groups. I think movements shouldn't feel scared to demand more from lawyers that represent them. That's one point that I would say in that regard. I think there's another question that seemed really interesting. Oh yeah, somebody called Marie was saying that do we collaborate with researchers as part of your litigation work? 100%. I have instructed experts to write reports to the courts. I've got a case that I'm doing where we've instructed a Black language expert, particularly language AAVE, to show the courts what this particular word means within Black radical thought, but also Black language practices. So for me, I always rely on researchers for my work, and if I'm even writing to CPS, ask them to challenge or challenging decision to prosecute this case and ask them to review it, I will refer to like reports and research from academia and academics. So I find the research coming out from the UN, whether it's from actual the academy, from scholars, really useful to my work, and very useful in the court in terms of when you're looking for certain experts to show the court what is the history of certain things. I think even for the case, the Colston 4 case, which is a case to do with the protesters that toppled the racist, well, the statue of the racist slave owner, they had an expert report by academic and historian David Soga, and he presented to the court the history of anti-blackness and racism that this particular slave owner took part in when he was enslaving Black Africans en masse. So yeah, I think there's definitely a need to use scientific literature and research in your movement lawyering practice as well.
Thank you, Aoife. Thank you both for joining us. There were a few other questions there. I think there was a general theme of people really wanting to find more, to learn more, read more on this topic and this subject. And what I would say is there's a chat now that's full of links and full of resources. Also, we're launching resources today, so I'll plug them again and do check them out and read through them. Also, look at the amazing work of Aoife and the European Women Rights Centre. We shared links to websites that where you can also find tools and information there as well. So there's lots of reading for us all to do. But I'd just like to thank you once again, Aoife, John. Thank you so much for taking the time and to speak with us today. I'd also like to thank Nani and Miriam to setting the scene today and introducing and talking us through the resources that we're launching today. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And finally, just want to extend a thank you to the entire systemic justice team that have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes and in the background to see this launch and this event happen. And we're so glad that we've been able to, celebrate it with you all today during this webinar. And we're very excited to continue building on this work. So thank you, everybody, and we'll let you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.